stable, and broad-based economic growth. Founded in 2013, we aim to bridge the gap between academic and policymaking communities. Thank you all for joining us for the latest installment of Equitable Growth Presents, Evidence for a Stronger Economy, which is our lecture series that seeks to foster a deeper understanding of cutting-edge research and analysis on economic inequality and growth. These lectures bring together leading scholars to explore how new research is shifting important conversations in academia and economic policy. Our event today, Harnessing Technology for Worker Power and Inclusive Prosperity, could not be more timely. Automation, workplace surveillance, and artificial intelligence are not merely abstract ideas being speculated about. On the contrary, these technologies are part of what's contested in the WGA workers' strike as we speak. But new technologies and their impacts are not simply natural forces or something that appears out of thin air. In fact, we cannot understand today's economy without first understanding how economic and political institutions shape technology's impact on work, productivity, and society at large. That's why I'm so thrilled that today's presentation and conversation features Daron Acemoglu, the Institute Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who alongside Simon Johnson is the co-author of the book, Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. He's also a co-lead research advisory board member, David Otter, of an exciting new initiative at MIT, Shaping the Future of Work, which focused on our nation's job quality crisis. Daron's expertise spans a wide range of areas, including political economy and economic development and growth, among many others. His recent research examines the political, economic, and social causes of differences in economic development across societies, and how technological innovation impacts growth, the distribution of resources, and is itself determined by economic and social incentives. His presentation will be followed by an esteemed panel of researchers and policy experts with diverse backgrounds on worker power, inequality, and technology policy, and will be moderated by Equitable Growth's own senior policy analyst, Catherine Zekier. If you haven't already, I encourage you to read Catherine's recent informative interview with Daron on Equitable Growth's website, which we will drop a link to in the chat. Before I hand it off to Daron, a few housekeeping notes. You can't see each other right now, but I can assure you that our audience brings a wealth of knowledge and a diversity of perspectives to the topics at hand. So it's my sincere hope that you all will participate in the chat throughout the event. Also, we will be compiling attendee questions for our presenters throughout the event, so please submit your questions along with your name and affiliation for the speakers in the Q&A box. If you encounter technical questions or difficulties, you can send a direct message to the EG Events account in the chat. Finally, please note that this lecture is being recorded and is on the record, so feel free to tweet away and use the hashtag EGPresents in your posts. And with that, please join me in welcoming Daron Acemoglu.
Thank you very much, Shayna. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, of course, for the invitation. It's a true pleasure to be here at this event organized by the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I couldn't think of a better organization under whose auspices Simon and I would be giving our first public talk on our book after its launch yesterday. And I think, as I'm going to share in the next few minutes, the topics we try to cover in this book are very much central to the issue of equitable growth. So without further ado, let me share my screen to show a few slides that will help me setting up the set of issues at hand here. So the book is entitled Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. And Simon and I are motivated to understand how better to build the foundations of future equitable growth and shared prosperity. The book comes out of the belief that these questions are more urgent today than before, and they are completely entangled with questions of the future of technology. No doubt that there are breathtaking, impressive advances in artificial intelligence, and many in the media, in academia, in the public are mesmerized by these changes. But the central questions of who benefits and who controls the future of these technologies and the future of power and prosperity, I think are no less important today. Will generative AI serve only a small elite who controls this technology, or could it be leveraged for building the next phase of broad-based prosperity? To many, our age is unique. AI is often compared to fire or other transformative technologies of the past, but some of its proponents immediately add that it's going to have even more transformative effects than anything that we have seen. But Simon and I argue we have been here before in many ways. What is so foundational about AI is that it is following a vision shaped by powerful actors in society. And via this vision and via the direction that it's taking, it is having foundational impacts on every aspect of society. We have seen visionaries often powered by a techno-optimism and an ability to shape the public infrastructure and the means of production having similar effects before. This gentleman here, for example, Ferdinand de Lesseps, was one of the most important entrepreneurs and technologists of the second half of the 19th century. He was powered by his belief that the world demand for oceanic shipping would multiply rapidly, and that this required more and better canals linking every different part of the world. And against the advice of many, including some scientists, he spearheaded the construction of the Suez Canal. He proved many wrong by being able to convince the Egyptians, the French government, even the British, and organizing the building of a canal without locks so that ships could pass quickly. And he proved right when he thought that people who could invest in this would make money and that new technological advances would come in order to make this canal a reality. But then, less than 2 decades after that, his vision and hubris led him astray in trying to build a canal at Panama when conditions were very different, but he ignored them, when his techno-optimism got in the way, and the outcome was ruin, financial ruin for thousands of people, but also more than 22,000 people dead at Panama, including thousands of French engineers as young as 20, right out of school. What led de Lesseps astray was his top-down vision that his ideas were right and he knew where the future lay, and he was able to impose that on society. That is common in many transformative episodes of technological change. But perhaps we don't have to worry about such aberrations, because there is the belief among many in academia and the industry that as new techniques and methods expand our capabilities, there are going to be automatic and powerful forces that will lay the foundations of shared prosperity. A particularly simple version of this in economics is what Simon and I call the productivity bandwagon. Technology improves, productivity rises, higher productivity makes firms seek more labor, and this pushes up wages and workers also benefit. Again, we have been here before because many important technological turning points have been justified by a version of this productivity bandwagon. But our survey of 1,000 years of history suggests that the productivity bandwagon isn't as automatic or strong as its proponents believe. The medieval age, for example, was far from the dark ages that people sometimes label it as. There were many important new techniques and technologies that were being implemented, perhaps none as important as new mills, first water mills and then windmills, that really changed the nature of industry. Despite significant improvements in productivity, there is no evidence that peasants actually benefited. All of the additional output that was produced by better mills was captured by the aristocracy and the clergy and not by the workers. Another turning point in technology is Eli Whitney's cotton gin. There were versions of the cotton gin before Whitney's, but he is often credited with the most important version of it. Before the gin, US South could not produce much cotton because they couldn't, the varieties that were available in the South wouldn't be, were not appropriate for existing gins. Eli Whitney's technology changed it at one fell swoop, and the United States became the largest exporter of cotton in the world. This huge increase in productivity did not benefit the workers who were at the front end of cotton production, most of them slaves. And in fact, slavery intensified and got much worse as people were moved forcefully to the deep South where new cotton plantations were opened. Even more symbolic in the annals of technology is the Industrial Revolution. No doubt that today we owe our much greater comfort, health, and prosperity relative to people who lived 300 years ago. We owe that to the Industrial Revolution, or to the process that started in the middle of the 18th century in the UK. But the early phases, the first 80, 90 years of the Industrial Revolution, were full of hardship. Automation, meaning new machinery that displaced workers, for example, weavers, intense monitoring in the factory system, and much worse living conditions meant that the working class suffered hugely during this almost century. Today, we think of mechanized power as the symbol of the Industrial Revolution, but the early phase is much better captured by Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, which he thought not just for prisons, but for factories as a way of better monitoring and squeezing workers out, or the tremendously unhealthy conditions that reduced life expectancy by a great deal during these decades. This is not just history for history's sake. There are aspects of the current growth experience of industrialized nations that is so different than the first 80 years of the Industrial Revolution. But there are also elements of parallels. In this picture, you can see both of them. I'm plotting the evolution of real weekly earnings of 10 different demographic groups here, men and women by different education groups. Everything is normalized to 0 in 1963, so you can see how these real earnings are changing. You first get a glimpse of the type of economic growth, the type of shared prosperity that the United States, like many other industrialized nations, experienced in the decades that followed World War II. Until the mid-1970s, there is very rapid growth of real earnings for all demographic groups. In fact, those curves are all on top of each other, indicating that both low education and high education, both men and women, are benefiting from these wage growth. And this is really rapid growth. Real earnings is growing by about 2.5 percentage points a year in real terms. Really striking shared prosperity. If you go back to the 1950s, it's even more transformative because you see inequalities declining as the economy is actually growing very fast. This is the period of a rising tide lifting all boats, or most boats at the very least, but it comes to an end in a rather abrupt manner. You see that from 1980 onwards, you have a very different pattern. Different curves are going in different directions, indicating a major increase in inequality, but it's actually worse than that. You see that the real earnings of high education groups, for example, the dark blue, which is for workers with postgraduate degrees, is growing, while low education groups, the orange, workers with without a high school degree, or the green, those with just a high school degree, is declining quite significantly, so that those low education groups today earn significantly less than they did in the late 1970s. This is a very stark form of unshared growth. Now, the patterns that you see in that figure are somewhat unique to the United States, which has very weak union power, very weak norms that limit inequality in workplaces, and relatively low minimum wages. So not many other industrialized countries experience this bottom falling out of the wage distribution. But the disappearance of many middle-class jobs, increases in inequality, stagnant earning for low-wage workers are very common in the world, in the developed world. So here, for example, looking at an omnibus measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, you see that the United States was a leader in inequality as early as the mid-1980s, and it has had a very large increase. But similar rises are visible everywhere, in Scandinavia, in Germany, in the UK, in Japan. What leads to this type of inequality? This question is central for understanding why we have not been able to build shared prosperity over the last 4 decades, and whether we have a chance of doing so in the age of AI. To do that, let's go back a little bit more and understand what it is that made a version of the productivity bandwagon work in the early decades of the 20th century, then again after World War II. And Simon and I argue that always there are 2 pillars of this type of shared prosperity or a productivity bandwagon: new tasks for workers and worker power. What I mean by that is that the process of mechanization always transforms the nature of work. In the course of that, you are going to have many of the tasks that workers used to perform disappearing as new machinery is introduced. This was a very important part of the reason why skilled artisans lost their advantages and earnings during the Industrial Revolution, because better textile machinery displaced first spinners and then weavers. 19th century throughout saw new machinery in workplaces. And the early 20th century was witnessed an acceleration in the introduction of machinery, for example, in car factories and other manufacturing workplaces. But as exemplified by the picture that we have here from Ford's Motor Company in the Rouge plant in 1919, this process of automation also was accompanied by a complete transformation of work that introduced a lot of new tasks for workers. This was driven by central use of electricity, new technical, sophisticated tasks, maintenance, repair, and design, new engineering functions within the manufacturing establishments, and also the rise of clerical and non-production workers playing a major role in manufacturing. As a result, more new tasks and jobs were created in these factories as what was lost to automation. So it's an exemplification of this balanced nature of new tasks and automation. But even that is not enough for shared prosperity, because new tasks ensure that worker productivity increases, workers play useful roles, as you can see along that production line in the upper picture. But if all power rests with employers, because unions are disorganized, there isn't the right type of regulation. Firms also invest excessively in monitoring and surveillance, disempowering workers, then all of those gains will be captured by managers and bosses and not go to workers. During the same time period, we also see in the United States, as exemplified, for example, the sit-down strike of the United Auto Workers, workers started becoming more organized so that they ensured better working conditions and a fairer share of the increase in productivity, countervailing forces that protected and increased worker power. So against this background, why did things go wrong in the digital age? I would say both of those pillars that I mentioned got dismantled, and at the same time, a different vision, perhaps even more pernicious than the one that guided Ferdinand de Lesseps, took hold of managers and the technology sector. First, there was too much focus on automation and not enough on creating new tasks. In the Ford Motor Company, you saw new machinery combined with workers performing new tasks and acquiring greater skills. In many manufacturing establishments throughout the United States, automation has been rapid since the 1980s, but the new tasks haven't accompanied them. You see the consequences of that when you look at the details of what has transpired in terms of wages. So here, a chart that summarizes over a decade of work that I have done with Pasquale Restrepo on the effects of automation on wages and inequality. In this picture, each circle corresponds to a demographic group, so a little bit more detail than the earlier picture where I had groups distinguished by education and gender. Here, it's education, age, gender, and ethnicity. Size of the circle is how large it is, how large that demographic group is in 1980. And then the colors tell you what the level of education of the relevant demographic group is. For example, orange is postgraduate and so on. On the vertical axis, I have change in the hourly wage or weekly wage. They're the same, you get the same pattern between 1980 and 2016. On the horizontal axis, we have the estimate that Pasquale and I derive of how much of the tasks that demographic group used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated by office software, industrial equipment, and robots. And you see a striking pattern of wage changes and inequality evolution. First of all, consistent with the first picture that I showed you, a lot of demographic groups are experiencing significant wage declines. This is the zero here. So you see many demographic groups are below zero, which means that overall, cumulatively, their real wages have declined since 1980. Second, all of these groups that are experiencing these wage declines are those that have also experienced significant encroachment of the tasks that they used to perform. Third, just this measure of automation does a very powerful job of explaining much of the inequality changes since 1980. So to a first approximation, the reason why there has been so much stagnation and even decline of real wages and so much increase in inequalities that we have gone all in automation, but not enough in terms of maintaining worker power and creating new tasks. But all of this was embedded in an institutional setting. And that institutional setting, combined with a very different vision of what businesses should be about, cannot be separated from the technological direction that the US economy took. There are many determinants of this, but two are particularly important to me and Simon, so we emphasize those. One is that a new vision of what the business corporation should be about and what managers should prioritize emerge, often associated with Milton Friedman, although many other people were contributors to this, which is that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits and only that. So in particular, if you can squeeze workers harder and make more money for shareholders, that's great management. That's exactly what managers should do. And if you have the tools, like digital tools, to reduce worker functionality, automate more tasks, that's welcome according to this vision. And at the same time, decline of manufacturing, but also institutional changes, for example, around the turning point of the defeat of the professional air controller strike in 1981 by Ronald Reagan, further reduce worker power that could have resisted or that could have pushed for a different direction of technological change. Now, this is all the past. Digital technologies are also central for the future, but probably in the form of artificial intelligence. Can that be different? Simon and I argue, yes, in principle, yes, but no in practice, because the future of technology and who controls technology are going even in a worse direction today in the age of AI. One way of understanding that is to go back to the foundational visions of AI. And there are two separate visions you can identify. One that goes back to at least to Alan Turing or other mathematicians such as Church is one of machine intelligence. Machines are going to be designed so that they are better than workers, reach human parity, and they're going to automate work. or they're going to have control over humans. The other one that goes back to Norbert Wiener, Douglas Engelbart, J.C.R. Licklider, is that machines should be useful to humans. Their main function is to augment humans. If you want to simplify it, one is about the Turing test. The other one is about things like hypertext or the mouse that made computers much more usable for humans, both of them spearheaded by Douglas Engelbart in the 1960s, for example. The problem is that when you fixate on machine intelligence, you're not just buying into a different philosophy of technology, you're also damaging productivity and damaging inequality. It may appear that machines becoming more intelligent is going to be a major booster of productivity. But what my research with Pasquale Restrepo and Simon Johnson points out is that oftentimes that doesn't work out that way, because actually humans are pretty good. They have unique skills, they have communication, they have social intelligence, they have creativity, adaptability. So if you start putting machines excessively, you get what Pasquale and I call social automation, like checkout kiosks or automated customer service that never works. You don't get the productivity benefits, but you displace workers, you create inequality. Perhaps you create a few more dollars of profits for a few corporations, but its effects are not revolutionary on productivity. Now, we weren't sure whether this answer was right, so we asked ChatGPT, will generative AI reverse these long-term trends? And ChatGPT thinks not. Perhaps, but probably not was the answer. Now, we don't know whether that's because ChatGPT read our work and is parroting it back to us, or it reached this conclusion independently, but we are comforted in at least our conclusion, if not about the future of the US economy. At the same time, we are seeing a worst form of technology use as surveillance is intensifying with massive data collection. AI doesn't need to be about boundless data collection, but the current machine intelligence vision pushes us in that direction, because the way that you try to replicate human intelligence or human capabilities in a range of tasks is try to collect as much data as possible and then try to replicate what humans were trying to do, even if the machines don't really understand how humans are doing it. But one consequence of this is that with more data comes greater power in the hands of those who control the technology and who control data. People draw a big distinction between what's going on in China with surveillance technologies or the social credit system, where the Chinese Communist Party is in power, and what goes on in the United States, where data is being collected by for-profit corporations such as Google, Facebook, Microsoft. Well, to us, there are differences, but there are many parallels as well. Whoever controls data in the age of AI controls the future of technology, is capable of deciding where to push society and where to push workers, and how to monitor and monetize different types of data and information. This, to us, is an alarming state of affairs. If we continue on our current path, we're going to get more inequality, we're going to get bigger discrepancies of power, and we're going to have more decimation of shared prosperity. But we don't think this is an inevitable future. Simon and I are sometimes asked, what will AI bring? And our answer is, whatever we choose it to bring. It is our choice. And that has to start with one critical statement: change the narrative away from techno-optimism. The techno-optimism, which often is entangled with hubris, just like it was in the 19th century for Ferdinand de Lesseps, tells us that the future of technology is inevitable. It will arrive upon us, and the best thing we can do in order to benefit from that is let talented geniuses be in charge of technology. It could be one or the other, but somebody from Silicon Valley or some other milieu has to be in control of technology. Well, we disagree. Our read of history, our understanding of the present says, no, that's just one narrative, and it's an incorrect narrative. We have to change the narrative, because I think if we want to build shared prosperity, digital technologies are key, but we have to shape the future of digital technologies. That means democratic control of technology. That involves building countervailing powers. What form will they take? I don't know. I don't think Simon knows either. Is it going to be in the form of the labor movement as it was in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s? Probably not. Is it going to be like consumer civil society organizations like Ralph Nader organized for activist consumer protection? Perhaps. Could it be in the form of workplace organization? Possibly, like the Amazon Staten Island labor union organization 2 years ago illustrates. Even though we don't know what form it will take, we are convinced that it has to take some form because more voices on the future of technology is key. But also critical is that those voices should not be viewed as a blockage of technology. The role of unions, the role of labor organizations, civil society organizations is not to block technological change. Simon and I are all for technological change. We are completely certain that a better future requires better use of technology. It means more innovation, but it's the direction of innovation. So which means that a critical step of this democratic control is to redirect technological change. And we have to go back to the vision of people like Norbert Wiener, Engelbart Licklider, or this gentleman, Ted Nelson, which is that computer power has to be given to the people. That was a vision that many people had. It did not come to reality, but it wasn't a silly vision. People like Ted Nelson and many of his associates were not wrong that that was a possible path. It's just not the path that IBM, Microsoft, and large corporations chose in the United States, but we can go back to it. This might appear like too much optimism. How can you control the gales of creative innovation? Can the government or even society have a role in redirecting technological change? And Simon and I say, hell yes. And we've done it many times before. We've done it in the 19th century. We've done it in the early 20th century. And in fact, we've done it even in some of the most transformative questions facing us today, such as energy. Our track record is not great when it comes in combating climate change, but there is one silver lining over the last 15 years. There has been tremendous redirection of technological change towards green renewable energy. And things like solar panels, concentrated solar power, onshore wind have become much cheaper over time relative to fossil fuels, now making an energy transition a much more feasible option than it was 20 years ago. This happened with a small amount of subsidies to green innovation and a lot of societal involvement, because a main driver was that the public wanted cleaner technology. Workers, consumers, civil society organizations pushed for it, and companies were compelled to accept it. We think that what was achieved with this modicum of action in the climate change domain can be done in digital technologies, and it can be a foundation for a much better future and for shared prosperity. Thank you very much, and Simon and I are looking forward to your comments and discussion.
Thank you for such a fascinating presentation, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Catherine Zekier. I'm a Senior Labor Market Policy Analyst here at Equitable Growth, and I'll be moderating our discussion now as we dive into these topics with our panel of experts. As everyone comes on, I'll just say that in about 30 minutes, we'll have time for audience questions for all of the panelists. So for those who are logged in on Zoom, please just submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. All right, so today, Daron and I are joined by Virginia Dolgast, professor at the Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations, Brian Chen, the policy director at Data and Society Research Institute, and Simon Johnson, a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management and co-author with Daron of the book Power and Progress. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to start out by asking everyone to share their response to Daron's presentation. What stood out to you? What are some of the connections to your own work that you saw? Virginia, can I start with you?
Sure, thanks. I have to say I read this book over the weekend, so I can not only respond to the presentation, but to the book itself. And I just want to start off saying this is a really great book, so you should all read it. It's very easy to read. It has a sweeping history, 1,000 years of technological change. And there's a very clear argument that follows through and is illustrated with a lot of great stories. And so, there's a lot in this book, but in a way, a simple take-home message, which really resonates with my own field of industrial and labor relations. And I think that lesson is that we need strong labor and social movements if we really want companies to use new technologies in more productive and fair ways. And so in my own research, I've been studying AI and digitalization in the IT and telecom industries, which are really at the core, the epicenter of creating these technologies, but also applying them at work. So in some ways, they're ahead of many other sectors on the forefront of this, and unions also are on the forefront of negotiating over these new technologies and how they're used, and in a way kind of consistent with a lot of the arguments and the findings historically from this book. Unions and works councils do make a big difference in coming up with creative ways to invest in new skills, to turn these technologies to more productive uses within firms, and negotiating really creative ways in which you can both have digital innovations and have real shared gains for labor and management on a more equitable basis. So if I were to summarize the main argument here on what needs to happen to get us to technology-enabled shared prosperity, Daron and Simon are saying we need to fight on two fronts. First, a successful movement has to build collective bargaining and labor market institutions. I don't know that was highlighted in the presentation, but it's very clear in the book. Basically, to force firms and their investors to share profits with workers, to invest in models of technology adoption that complement worker skills. So there's that one piece that's really about building institutions or institutional power. But then second, they talk about something that in my field we call communicative power or ideational power. I think they talk about agenda setting power, which reminds me of Stephen Luke's, who I read many years ago, sociology. And they say here, labor and social movements really need to fight against a vision oligarchy led by elites to convince the public these kinds of policies that reign in free markets and business power will be good for everyone. But I think, the bigger point they're making is that economies overall do worse when we leave firms to their own devices. It's this classic foundational idea in industrial relations that institutions like unions can be productive constraints on employers, help them compete through investing in worker skills and voice rather than low wages. But making that simple point can also often feel like fighting an ideological battle. So Daron and Simon are showing it's really an empirically grounded argument in a way. In some ways you're making the ideological or the agenda setting argument, but you can draw on history and facts and data to show that you actually need these things to get to that outcome. I think this book makes that point in a compelling way through many historical examples and stories. So it's really needed contribution to these debates that comes at a good time.
Great, thank you. And next, Brian.
Yeah, I really appreciated Daron's presentation. So it made me think of my own work. And before I started at Data and Society, I was working as an attorney at the National Employment Law Project, where I was leading campaigns on gig workers' labor rights. And I think as we're talking about technological innovations and how it affects workers and their working conditions, I think we can do far worse as a kind of test case of that than the app-based economy, and a pretty good case on how technological gains don't necessarily produce these kind of shared prosperity, wider gains for society and workers, right? Like this smartphone is great. It has really incredible computing power. It has GPS, but it also has led to this underclass of racialized minority workers who drive people around and deliver meals and who don't have rights as employees, right? So that part really resonated with me. Now at Data and Society, where our organization is a research institute that looks at the social consequences of data-centric technologies. And one of the dimensions of that is how technology affects people and their communities and marginalized communities in particular. And really one of the foremost ways that we're looking at this is how is technology really degrading work and undermining statutory labor rights? And I think really Daron's presentation got at this towards the end, but we are now at this moment of AI, generative AI. And one of these big policy questions that is popping up almost every day now is AI going to replace workers? Is ChatGPT going to take your job? And we see that there are companies that are doing layoffs and saying, well, AI is going to replace workers. This is what we have to do. And I think that there are pretty good reasons to be skeptical of that claim. But even so, note the passive voice of AI is going to replace workers. What really is happening is that employers are saying, I'm going to use AI to replace you. There is an active voice there. There's a choice being made by employers, which goes again back to the question of, this is about employer and management power. This is about AI serving their interests and not workers' interests. But going back to the automation question, I do want to make the point that if AI cannot fully automate and replace workers, which I am not confident that it can, but if it can't do that, then I think really the question is, how is AI going to degrade work? What is it going to do to the workplace? What are the ways in which it will make work crueler and more surveilled? How will it further encourage speed ups? And so for me, the question is, how can we confront the power dynamics between labor and management, between tech corporations and ordinary people, so we don't have to see the worst of that? So that's a bit about my work, but I really resonated with Daron's presentation and looking forward to discussing more.
Thank you. And Simon, over to you.
Well, Daron already presented my work, or our joint book, and a lot of Daron's other work with people like Pasquale Restrepo. I thought you did a good job. So let's start with that. Thanks, Virginia, for those really astute and on point remarks about unions and the importance of collective bargaining and so on. That's exactly the context we were trying to communicate. Thank you. And Brian, absolutely, the data piece and the link between data society and the kinds of jobs you get, that's also very much what I'm interested in. But maybe, Catherine, I can add a little bit to this conversation from the perspective of another conversation I just had with people involved in the writers' strike, the WGA confrontation, because I think that the issues in that strike are quite central to what we write about in the book, what Virginia talked about and what Brian works on. And as I understand it, the studios or the producers want to use AI to basically reduce dramatically the amount of writers, number of writers, and the amount of writing hours you need to produce shows. But even when you dig into it a little bit more deeply, Catherine, within the studio space, there seems to be a distinction between some of the traditional studios and the tech companies that are big players in this space, including Apple, Amazon, but I think also Microsoft and Google, frankly. And it's not too far-fetched to imagine that if they are allowed to do whatever they want with AI, given where the capabilities of that software, those algorithms is going, they may well be able to strip the people out of not just the writing side, but also other parts of the movie business. And this could happen really, really fast. I mean, Daron talked about previous transformations. We've seen automation of factories, for example, Henry Ford's application of electricity. And that wave of technology deployment took about 30 years. Some people would say it took longer. We may be seeing something that happens in 3 years, 18 months, 1 year, that is dramatic in terms of eliminating positions. And where do the new jobs come from? Where are the new tasks? What's that process? And it's not the case that the people driving this are necessarily evil or fundamentally want to destroy the base of the American economy, American society. I think they are, as Daron said, driven by business is business. We're just here to make profit. Everything else is someone else's problem. But yeah, look where that got us so far. And just I want everyone to look at that writer's strike and to dig into it and to read up on it. And we can send around the link to the podcast I was just on, because I thought that the people running that, Todd Garner and Billy Ray, were really insightful, and have people reflect on how what we're going to learn, what we are learning, what we will learn from the writers' strike that matters for all the sectors everywhere in the economy.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great connection. I want to dive into some of those issues a bit more. And just to pick up on some things we've mentioned so far, I'd like to start out by talking about workers' roles in how technology is designed and implemented. And I'm trying to use that terminology very specifically because, as we've been discussing, technology is not just some natural force. It's just a series of decisions. And so both the design, the implementation, how it's experienced, all those, so we've been hearing, are really shaped by our policy environments, those countervailing forces, those productive constraints that we've heard. But right now, sort of in our current policy environment, new technologies are often used to monitor workers, to reduce wages, to automate labor, and often to de-skill the jobs themselves, to, in part, to facilitate this automation and the reduction of wages. But again, we have a lot of choices over how we use technology and also how we design jobs. So whether workers are there to support automated processes or whether we use technology to support workers. So Daron, I'd actually like to jump back to you. What are some ways that workers or unions have shaped the design and use of technology in the workplace? What are some things we can learn from going forward?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Catherine. And let me sort of amplify. First of all, thank you, Virginia, for those excellent comments. And, there are many intersections between your work and this book. And thank you for bringing some of them. And I'm sure you'll bring a few more of them as well. And thank you, Brian, as well. And I want to amplify something that Brian and Simon said, both sort of hinted at, which is, if you think of AI like replacing workers wholesale, that's impossible. I think the current level of capabilities, even in the best language models, is not going to enable any of these technology to do even the simplest occupations anywhere like what humans can do. But at the same time, this is not going to stop some employers prematurely or excessively automating some tasks, as we have seen in customer service, as we have seen in office work, as we'll see more in other types of white-collar decision-making tasks. And this is our fear, that there will be more and more automation or artificial intelligence. When you do that, you're not going to get the productivity benefits, but you're going to get a lot of damage on the workers. And when you combine that, as I try to emphasize and Brian amplified, with greater monitoring and greater structuring of work in a way that's anti-worker, then that could be a real big problem for workers. So against that, clearly, some sort of alternative path has to be encouraged. Some of this is national. Federal government has to play a role, civil society has to play a role, but workplace relations, negotiations have to play a role as well. And I think when I look at the history of US labor movement from this vantage point, I see a lot of failure, but some successes as well. And I can give you some examples of the successes, but let me actually tell you what Simon and I think is the general principle. The general principle is that if labor is weak, it's not going to work very well. But if unions are there or workers are there and they just push for higher wages, that's not going to work either. If you are in the age of AI, age of automation, you leave everything else as it is in the United States, and workers just say, we want $5 higher wages. That's going to give more. It's going to be more fuel on the fire of automation. So what worker organizations need to do is negotiate about how to better restructure the workplace. Not just higher wages, but also use technology training and reorganization in a way that makes human unique skills better employed. And when Simon and I look at the past of the US labor movement, that's where successes lie. When UAW negotiated not just for higher wages, but better training, more job titles that involved higher technical capabilities and higher productive options for workers. When longshoremen on the West Coast were able to allow containerization and new equipment to be introduced, but at the same time created new jobs for workers. I think we have to find the new chapter for that. And that is not easy. especially in the United States, where the bargaining unit is typically the establishment. So it makes sectoral agreements much harder, where we need a lot more of the sectoral agreements, where there's a conflictual relationship, and the shareholder value ideology makes managers very hostile to any type of worker voice. And that's where the cross-country setting is very useful. Things are very different, as Virginia can tell us, in Germany or Scandinavia, where sectoral bargains and work councils and communication and reorganization of work within that framework can happen much more fluidly.
No, thank you. And actually, I'll take that opportunity. Virginia, I would love to hear about your work on this. What are some of the examples and possibilities you've seen?
Great. And I guess before giving an example, I just want to echo this point, right? That unions aren't just important in laying down rules that require employers to invest in these wages, skills, or job security that has historically and today they're important in helping to design these alternative paths for technology. I think there are also examples in the book of this, but you can see many today where the unions are a vehicle for bringing employee voice and expertise into solving problems and coming up with alternatives. And a second point is just that these AI-based tools are part of a second phase of digitalization, which has already been transforming work since the 1990s, right? So we kind of treat it like a new thing, but algorithms actually are not that new. And certainly monitoring, outsourcing, all the kind of things that have been transforming work have been going on. So this is a kind of an intensification of things unions have already been trying to deal with. I think that's why studying these trends in IT and telecom firms, you see that unions have already worked out some tools and now they're trying to apply them to solving new problems in this space. So for example, in Germany, where I've done a lot of research over many years, but I was just there for a year, spending a lot of time in telecom firms, learning about call centers, technician jobs, also different IT and programming jobs, how they're being transformed. You see that works councils in a lot of tech firms, like Deutsche Telekom, IBM, are really drawing on their strong legal co-determination rights to negotiate over new technology. And there are these legal rights that say that where technology is used for performance and behavior control, basically works councils could have a right to veto a lot of those decisions. So that gives a really powerful tool where you have AI coming into the mix for you to just have works agreements that are banning the use of these kinds of tools or collection of individual performance data. So you see where you have strong unions and works councils, they're able to negotiate pretty creative agreements. And there have even been legal changes that now works councils have a right to bring in consultants where AI-based tools are used so they can get technical expertise to evaluate and understand these tools and to really come up with creative negotiations with management. So for example, I've been in workplaces where unions and works councils have used this as leverage to negotiate creative agreements, like drawing up a digital roadmap with management to plan out future investments on digital and AI and how they're going to impact jobs, how they might affect skills, creating workshops together with employees to design alternative ways and to think about what skills we have right now, which ones we have to invest in. An example from IBM Germany, they've set up an AI ethics committee where you have management worker representatives and AI experts. And of course, IBM's designing AI. So you do have a lot of people with that expertise within the workforce. And so they're coming up with really, they're reviewing regularly how AI is being used, making sure it's used in an ethical way, evaluating where there's higher risks to employees, and coming up with solutions to that. And that creates an environment where you have a lot of trust. And it's also in a context where you have collective agreements with unions that make sure that you have the distributional thing right? Where workers are working with these technologies, they can also improve their wages and conditions. So you see here legal support for worker voice in these decisions around AI and digital investments encourages really more collective deliberation about how new technologies are adopted. And management has to think out their planned investments. They have to explain them to stakeholders. They have to implement them in a more transparent and fair way. And so that's really the basis for mutual gains. And I think this resonates with Daron and Simon's argument, but it shows there are already these successful models of alternative approaches to sharing gains in places with stronger collective bargaining institutions. So that can be also a model for the US.
Yeah, no, thank you. And Brian, what are some of the ways, because we have, we want to think about policy and regulatory changes that we can make to maybe both in the short term to empower workers to speak up about, immediate effects from new technologies affecting them at work. But also just as we want to shape an environment where workers and unions can be a real voice in the shaping of the technology, shaping of work. Like what changes do we need to make to build those types of countervailing forces?
Well, I suppose I don't tend to believe that worker power derives from laws and regulations. I mean, certainly, the NLRA is great, and we support the PRO Act. But ultimately, workers' power comes from workers and their collective presence and power and organizing. I mean, look, there is a role in all of this for federal or global certain kind of standards and frameworks around AI and automation and automated decision systems. That is a great leveling of the playing field, and that can kind of set up a standard across the board. But ultimately, workers' power is going to build workers' power, and that is really going to be key in this. But I would like to also recognize that it is really difficult stuff for workers, any group of workers, to confront a lot of these issues. I've seen unions and worker centers really struggle on how to respond to technology, how to respond to increasing precarity and gig work. And there's oftentimes a lot of tensions between a short-term tactical win versus a long-term kind of, are we committing full force on full workers' rights in the face of all this electronic surveillance and management? So this is really difficult stuff, and there are going to be a lot of contradictions and lots of differences of opinions. But I do believe very firmly that it is going to be the power of workers that will have a say in this. And Virginia was talking a lot about kind of the European model, and I can't claim any kind of expertise about European labor. But what interests me is that, of course, organized labor is much different in Europe than in the US, and much stronger in Europe than in the US. And if things like AI and generative AI really reached a kind of boiling point, what would intrigue me is not so much, would the EU Commission be prepared to regulate this? Or, I would be interested in whether workers could organize a general strike around generative AI. That's the kind of thing where I think you could really see workers confronting this kind of a displacement in their lives.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Simon, I want to ask you a slightly different question. Keep an eye on the clock. Just the U.S., because I want to talk about the role of the U.S. government in improving labor standards, improving technology through its industrial policy. Because the government makes investments in industries and directs its spending. So even with technology itself, the U.S. government has often played a large role in the development and deployment of new technologies. So what can government intervention do to direct technology in more socially beneficial directions?
Well, first of all, Catherine, I really hope if we either get what Virginia wants or what Brian wants, then my agenda is less pressing. But becoming more like Germany seems like a stretch. Very sad, a little depressing to hear you explain all the things we need, Virginia. And then Brian, we're a long way from having that level of worker power. So I think you're asking the right question, Catherine, which is what can we do with workplace regulation? I would start with OSHA, actually. And I would start with surveillance, Catherine, because surveillance is a topic that people on the right and the left can agree on for different reasons. Maybe they're afraid of different people surveilling them, possibly. But having excessive surveillance and how surveillance is used in the workplace, I think could become a really interesting topic. And of course, also the way the US works is you want to get some very articulate people who have a lot of money on your side. And surveillance affecting them is also an interesting topic. So building an alliance and coalition around there strikes me, and Daron can speak for himself, as having potential. I think also the safeguarding of data, Catherine, because what we're seeing right now is violent violations of copyright and ownership of images, for example. So these AI algorithms are being trained without permission on data that we've put out there. And this reminds me, okay, it may not remind too many people, but it reminds me of enclosures in England in the late medieval time, where you take something that is previously common property, it's valued partly because it's shared and because nobody writes down what the property rights are. That becomes private property. It becomes valuable. It's becomes consolidated and leads to more power in the form of wealth. And what do people do with that wealth? They go off and they expropriate more land. So I think that's what's happening to data right now. And I think Daron Lanier has the right ideas on data unions. Shoshana Zuboff is a fantastic thinker about the surveillance capitalism and how to constrain it. And I also want to add, Catherine, taxes. So corporate taxation, particularly on companies that make massive profits from the AI business, which I nominate Google and Microsoft as the most likely candidates, but let's see. Kim Klausing of UCLA Law School, formerly of the Treasury Department, has a great idea for a graduated corporate income tax, where if you make mega profits, we'll apply a higher tax rate, and then there'll be pressure from your shareholders to break up, and then we'll get plurality of business models, which is one of Daron's very big points. We need more diversity of thinking about how to develop technology in ways that there's pro-worker, for example. We're not getting that right now. So let's have a graduated corporate income tax. Of course, right now we have a graduated system, but it goes the wrong way. If you're a global behemoth, you don't pay any tax, right? So I think those are issues where we could get some traction on the public policy side in the US.
Thank you. No, and that was such a great example as well. And right before we jump into the Q&A, because Equitable Growth is focused on supporting the connection between research, academic research, and policymaking, I just want to do a quick rapid fire for everyone. What type of, as policymakers, regulators, unions, worker groups, all sorts of stakeholders and decision makers trying to grapple with what can feel like very new shifts in technology and its impacts. What research would you like to see? We have a lot of academic researchers, folks from universities, obviously in this room, but also on this call. What research would you like to see on these issues? Daron, I'll start with you.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. Well, let me build on what Simon said. The current AI models, it's both a weakness and strength of them. They have a huge hunger for data. And in this, they are encroaching on all sorts of norms, property rights, and the labor of people that was meant to go in a very different direction. I think a major research area is, how we treat data, how we organize people who have data, what are the different types of data and how they need to be protected. For example, is it okay for Wikipedia's data to be used by OpenAI? Is it okay for people's images on Facebook to be used by all the researchers and visual, vision recognition, facial recognition software of companies? Do we need data unions? Do we need data markets? Or do we need regulations on data? How can we actually encourage these companies to use higher quality data in a better way, rather than just like funnel all data into a model that may or may not be the best way of using data? So I think there are a lot of questions about data that intersect with actually worker power, because the future workforce is going to be more and more going in the direction of knowledge. And if we don't protect data, I think we are really undermining one potential pillar of future worker power.
Thank you. And Brian, what research would you like to see?
Three things real fast. One more on the climate effects of what it takes for these massive, AI takes huge computers with huge power. The kind of climate consequences of having those processors. Two is the subcontracted labor force that actually is behind a lot of these algorithms, and that is really powering the kind of magic of these AI and LLMs. And then third is a kind of a cheating one, because I'm just saying a category, but more socio-technical research, right? A lot of the discussion around these systems, AI systems, is very technical. Can these technical systems do what they promise to do? Can they do it accurately without bias? And what I'd like to see more is kind of research, qualitative empirical research that gets to, what are these technologies actually doing to humans and their experiences of their workplaces, of their communities?
Excellent. Thank you. Virginia, what would you like to see?
I just wanted to first respond quickly to Daron's point around how data is used. I think this is a really interesting issue in the writer's strike, where you see a big demand is that it's not being trained on the writer's past material that they've produced. So there's a lot around this intellectual property of the workers themselves and how that is protected. And I'm also doing research right now in game development and have done a few interviews. So I'm not an expert yet, but I have been hearing about coding and also the use of AI for artists in game development. And the people who are experts were telling me that because right now there is the way in which these programs, AI-based programs that are helping with coding games or testing games are trained on some public open access data, which now is potentially running into copyright issues as companies are trying to use it to write new copyrighted games, right? And so this could potentially bring all kinds of lawsuits, and the view is that probably the lawsuits themselves will change behavior much more quickly than any legislation, which moves more slowly. Also, I think if we're talking about research, it's important to distinguish between these different kinds of AI effects that we're kind of bouncing between. On the one hand, you have impacts of technology on employment and location decisions, like automation, skills, work organization, outsourcing. And then on the other hand, you have it used as a management tool for intensifying monitoring or directing work, performance management. And each of those have kind of different questions. The first bucket is really calls for more industry specific research. So I would suggest you fund industry studies, right? Where we're doing more research digging into how these tools are actually being used, how supply chains are changing as you transition to e-mobility, for example, in the auto industry. What's happening? How are these technologies being negotiated over and adopted? And then on the other hand, the use as a management tool, which is a lot of these issues around how data, employee data is used, privacy. These can be more general. I think these similar kinds of issues cross many different sectors and workplaces. And so that calls for more kind of broad scale cross-cutting survey-based data, and that would be my recommendation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And before we move on to Q&As, Simon, last answer from you.
So in the book, we talk about machine usefulness as a potential concept to stand in contrast with machine intelligence. The idea being to find and help develop computers, algorithms, other forms of machinery that actually raise marginal worker productivity, particularly for lower income, lower education workers, Catherine. Now, I have to say, the book is completely stripped of all jargon with two exceptions. One of them is marginal worker productivity, because you have to confront that directly. And you have to talk about the productivity of that additional worker that you could hire, how much they bring to the table in terms of what they're creating, what the value is, and then how much you're willing to pay them. Obviously, other things matter too, like the union, whether there's a union and what the bargaining power is. But that's a key concept. And there's some fantastic ideas out there we talk about in the book, including Daron mentioned Doug Engelbart, but also Ted Nelson, I would like to stress, who was writing about this for years and years and years without getting much attention. We can see the general category. We can see the outlines of it, Catherine, but I think we need more work to understand precisely what is genuinely in this category of machine usefulness. And then you could put more R&D dollars into it. Then it can become a national priority. But right now, we're still trying to understand the very fine contours of that.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to move us into the Q&A because one of our first questions picks up on some of these threads. So this is from Pauline Kim at Washington University in St. Louis. So asking, what policy levers are available to shift this fixation on using AI to reproduce human intelligence focus instead on developing technologies to augment human capabilities, like we've been talking about. Brian, I'll start with you, but don't, you made the case for not just thinking about policy levers. So yeah, what do we need broadly to shift to focus on how to make tech work for workers?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this is, the federal government has levers in terms of where it can place its R&D money in resources such as the national AI resources, and in different kind of, as the federal government does its budgeting and appropriations, it can make decisions on where it chooses to, how it chooses to put its R&D. So I think there are ways it can do that in kind of technological R&D, and thinking about what are the productive or kind of socially productive use cases of AI that it chooses to do R&D towards. And again, I would say that it's again a question of how unions and workers would want to kind of focus their attention and the dialogue on AI and its use.
Hey, thank you. I'm gonna say, Virginia, do you have anything you want to add on sort of how we could encourage this type of development of technology?
I guess I'll try to stay away from Europe, where there are, of course, many more examples, but thinking about just the US, government is investing in digital infrastructure, right? So you have the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which had $65 billion for broadband investment, and CWA, Communications Workers of America, and other unions were really pushing for making sure there are worker protections in those bills. And there were some protections, right? Companies have to have a track record of compliance with labor law and there are certain mechanisms in there. States have to develop and submit plans outlining use of these funds for broadband deployment. So you have CWA activists focusing on state level campaigns to include strong labor and quality standards in these plans. That's one concrete kind of example where you can use public investment as a lever to try to put some basic conditions or to push for better working conditions attached to where the new technology is being built and how it's being deployed.
And Simon, I'd like to respond to this broadly if you want, but also one of the questions that we're getting from the audience is asking about a question from Lena Simmet at Human Rights Watch, asking about the idea of basically what should we be taxing? Should we also be considering a robot tax? Should we be focusing more on wealth taxes rather than income taxes? Like, especially if the way we're using technology reduces tax revenue collection through income taxes, then yeah, are there other types of taxes we should be thinking about?
Yes, absolutely. We do discuss this at length in the book, Catherine. We try to go through all the options, pros and cons. I mean, the one I would like to highlight, doesn't get enough attention, is scrapping, or more realistically, reducing payroll taxes. Now, payroll taxes exist for various reasons, economic and political, but this is raising the cost of labor at a time when we should be reducing the cost of labor. And I would go with a higher graduated corporate tax system in order to replace the revenue that you would lose by reducing the payroll tax. But whatever gets traction in the American context around taxes, moving in the right direction, I would absolutely support, Catherine. I think it's a super important lever, and it can make a difference. I don't think we're quite there yet on taxing robots, knowing what to tax, how to tax it, and making that work. But reducing the taxation of labor, that we could absolutely do.
Thank you. And Daron, what are your thoughts on?
Yeah, so let me say a few things. First of all, I think on Pauline's original question, vision needs to be countered with vision. I don't think there is legislation or simple policy that will make the most powerful actors in society and the economy suddenly change their vision. So an alternative set of priorities backed by countervailing powers needs to develop, and I think machine usefulness is an organizing theme for us, and it has good pedigree. But then there are a lot of policies that can encourage the marginal incentives, so incentives at the margin within the existing system to go in the right direction, redressing the imbalance of taxation of labor and capital, as Simon said, reducing payroll taxes, increasing corporate taxes is one element, but also the sort of low productivity use of AI is supported by an ecosystem where tech companies freely use data, and then they monetize that data in a number of ways that are not very productive. Individualized targeted digital ads or monitoring and surveillance that do not improve productivity. So we think those are the reasons why two of the proposals that we make in the book are actually both fair and productivity enhancing. One is a digital ad tax, so that business models centered on emotional outrage, filter bubbles, and so on are not encouraged. And second is regulation of data and perhaps data unions that make sure that free use of data doesn't become the linchpin of the business models of big tech.
Great, thank you. And we're getting a few other questions. I'll also say, if anyone has any questions for specific panelists, just feel free to put that in the questions so we know who to direct it to. And I have a question. Here's a question from Nat Baldino at the Center for Law and Social Policy. This is saying that the current technological state in the workplace is very tied to this lean production. So we've been talking about. So, in the service industry, production quotas are tied to point of sale services, barcodes, and QR usage. And all of this affects staffing, scheduling, pace of work, or in precision scheduled railroading. So just come back again to maybe workplace policy solutions. Virginia or Brian, I'll start with one of you. Are there policy solutions that can provide guardrails that can disrupt this entire modus operandi of production? Or are there historic examples of this kind of shift? One example might also be, Brian, is there's legislation right now that some states are working with around addressing pace of work, that can address pace of work in factories or warehouses. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I believe New York and maybe California have a warehouse, the state legislation upon the kind of warehouse production and regulating that warehouse production. On a federal level, I can't think of anything that would kind of, to Nat's question, kind of outright disrupt that kind of entire model of lean production. I think there's pending legislation, proposed legislation that might affect parts of it and kind of the precise scope of when and where and how certain parts of surveillance employers are permitted to use surveil workers at certain times and when they can't. That would, if not disrupt, perhaps kind of give a few kicks or nudges to the lean production model. I'm thinking of Senator Bob Casey, the senator from Pennsylvania, has really tried to carve out a lane on some of this worker surveillance issues. So there may be bills there, but Catherine, to your point, I think really the state legislation provides some promising models.
Yeah, Virginia, are there any lessons from Europe on how to just shift away from this lean production, this very lean, just-in-time approach that we have that's just so connected to all these harms for workers, especially like very low wage or more precarious workers?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to answer that. I wouldn't say that there's I don't think anywhere I've seen actual wholesale moving away from lean production. But certainly I can give one example from Germany. It was an interesting case negotiated between Works Council and management over how to create more flexible schedules. So connected to workers, call center workers now working from home, and a lot of other service workers who are doing remote service. And they were finding that they wanted to have much more tailored schedules so that they could decide exactly what hours they were working. And then you had management with their customer demand coming at kind of unpredictable times, but increasingly they can predict more precisely using AI when those calls are coming and who exactly they should go to. So they had a joint project together with the IT department in their organization to negotiate a new AI-based scheduling tool. And that scheduling tool was then going to be used, and it was strongly regulated by both sides. So it was meeting both worker demands for control and flexibility in their working time and management demands for having workers matched with the calls coming in. And from what the Works Council said, both sides were really happy with the results. So it did provide this opportunity for mutual gains and maybe moving a little bit away from some of the strictly scheduled kind of aspects of a lean production model.
Yeah, and I also like that example because one of the reasons, Brian mentioned gig work earlier. One of the reasons often given for the importance of gig work for those workers, that gives them flexibility in their scheduling. And I think that also shows that that you can have workers can have all the protections of formal work arrangements. They can be protected by our wage and hour laws and have all these sorts of work protections and still have scheduling flexibility, as opposed to unpredictable scheduling. Like it can be used in service of centering their needs as well. And I love that. So actually, I want to ask something that we talked about it when we were preparing for this event, and we didn't get to it. And I just want to talk about this because we've been talking about so many harms from technology. And I know that what are some of the alternative visions of the future we could have? Because we're talking about all these harms of technology that we're experiencing now, and that's all taking place within our current systems of power, our current labor institutions. It's a little hard sometimes to think about what we could have if some of those things were different. So yeah, what are some of those alternative visions that you have? What are some positive visions of what AI could do? What would you like to see technology be used for? Daron, do you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah. And in fact, I can build on like the earlier question. In the book, we break down lean production into two parts. One is, the re-engineering the corporation using digital technology, which often meant eliminating lots of tasks. And second is scheduling, monitoring, clopening, and all sorts of things that empower the management and disempower workers. And in both cases, we argue these haven't really improved productivity because, it's not actually making better use of human resources. And to us, the promise of AI is that on both fronts, it has the capacity to make much better use of workers. So rather than just eliminate workers, of course, there's going to be automation. There has always been automation. There should be automation. But as you automate some tasks, for example, you take the more routine tasks away from some office workers, you also give them better information that enables them to become better decision makers, that expands their capabilities, that expands their autonomy. That would be the alternative to re-engineering the corporation or re-engineering the corporation via AI in a more pro-human or humanist way. At the same time, exactly like Virginia put her finger on exactly the right thing. AI has the capacity, if it's regulated well. I don't think in the US it would happen just via worker organizations, but if it's regulated well, for example, within the context of OSHA and other things, to actually be a tool for providing the right type of flexibility for workers. So what is it that workers want? Actually, it turns out that workers want many, many different things depending on who they are. Mothers of young children want predictable hours. Some other workers want flexible hours. So AI would actually, rather than sort of cookie cutter, we're going to enable the management to set your hours. Now you can see what are the preferences of workers. How can we make that work with the needs of the business? I think AI provides great empowering tools to modern workers in that context.
Yeah, and Simon, I'm going to go to you next. What else could we do with technology, AI and other technologies?
Well, I'm going to go really big on this one, Catherine.
Right.
And I would say, I wouldn't start with what I want technology to do. I would start with the problems that we want to solve and the tough problems, the problems we struggle with, the problems that with our existing resources and organizations and ways of thinking we've not solved. So affordable childcare would be one. Affordable housing for seniors would be another. Mental health crisis and homelessness would be another. Kathy, these happen to be things that my friends work on, okay? And I talk to them a lot, and they are very tough problems. But I think, and this is in line with what Daron said, which is if are there technology solutions or approaches that could help us solve those problems or think about better ways of organizing flow of resources or cost sharing or whatever it is, I think that's what we should look at. And if the answer is AI, great. If it's not, Catherine, I don't care. I mean, AI is should be nothing but a tool to us. And the goal should be to solve human problems in a sustainable way, in a responsible way. Oh yeah, climate change. I guess we could add that one to the mix, right? How are we going to really move the needle on these problems? And how do we take control? We do control technology already. We just don't realize it. And we delegate it to Elon Musk, or he said he's like, okay, I'll take it from you. That's not going to get you the outcomes that you want, honestly. You want to recognize social control over technology. We can direct it. It's built on our data. So, if we don't stand up for it and protect those data rights, that's on us, right? Let's tilt the whole process and the whole orientation of all our technology infrastructure towards solving the problems that really matter.
No, thank you. I love that. And yeah, instead of just looking around and seeing what we can use this hammer for, think of just all the different tools that we have to solve these. And so I'll go Virginia and then Brian to close us out, because I think we'll be done after this. But Virginia, how would you like to use technology, AI and other technologies? What vision would you like to see that supports and centers workers and help society?
Well, I would just echo what's already been said. Ideally, you imagine, or generations of humans, thousands of years maybe of humans have imagined you could use technology to eliminate more routine tasks, take over boring paperwork and form filling. Some of these, when it's interesting, we're doing a survey right now of call center workers, and we ask them questions about these different AI-based tools that are already being used in their workplace. And we have kind of two sets of tools. One were AI-based tools that were used to automate a lot of the routine parts of their jobs, right? So, to provide information for them on calls, to help them to find things more quickly, to provide tools to kind of fill in paperwork and the like. And then we ask questions about the management tools, right? Like monitor the pace of your work or provide scripts, follow what you're doing in your job. And of course, you might imagine the worker responses where they were pretty positive about all the things that were, peeling off the routine parts of their work. And they felt like in a lot of cases, it was improving customer service, it was improving the quality of the work that they were doing, or it was reducing stress, their feelings of stress. So, there's a lot of those kinds of possibilities. But I saw a tweet that said, this was not the future I wanted, where the robots make art and write poetry and we're left with minimum wage jobs. So it's kind of interesting that's being the focus these days in the news of all the way generative AI is being used to kind of replace the fun, creative parts of our work. And maybe, not doing the things we'd like it to do, which is replace the drudgery and leave us all more time to do those creative things.
Yeah, I think that's also just such a great example of how technology doesn't sort of naturally flow in any one direction, the way some thought it might, like 50, 70 years ago. So Brian, to close us out, how would you like to see technology used?
So when people think of AI, they think of something like ChatGPT, this large language model that works on a massive scale. So it requires huge amounts of compute power, of data scraping essentially the entire internet, and lots and lots and lots of underpaid workers to clean up the algorithm, clean up certain bugs in it. That is massive scale, right? Only massive big corporations with a lot of capital can do that at that scale. And so I think an alternative model is to have a more bounded scale set to a very specific problem with alternative kinds of data governance. And I'll give one example. There is a group called Tahiku Maori which developed and trained its own algorithms for natural language processing on the indigenous Maori language. So to Simon's point about identify the problem that they identified was that they have this indigenous language, it is disappearing, fewer and fewer people, young people are speaking it day to day, elders in the community are passing away. So this language is just kind of getting forgotten. And so this group created its own mechanisms, its own algorithms to train this algorithm on the Maori language. And it has certain kind of data sovereignty protocols so that people who want to use this AI model have to, it can't be used in ways that the community does not consent to. There's data sovereignty protocols so that the community has control over the data. These ideas are possible. And I think when we think of different kind of scale of like AI that can do everything, just set out to do one smaller problem and have the right safeguards in place.
Love that. Thank you. And thank you all for such a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you for all the Equitable Growth staff who made this possible, and for this wonderful audience. I'm so glad you're able to join us. Just keep an eye out for a follow-up email we'll be sending that has more information about the work from our speakers today, a link to a recording from the event, and ways to stay in touch in the future. So yeah, that's it. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah,
Brian,
thanks so
Virginia.
much. Really interesting discussion.
All right. Thank you all. Take care.
Bye-bye.